Hello everyone, and welcome to another webinar in our leadership series. In today's webinar, we will be discussing unconscious bias. My name is Dr. Donald Chick, and I am President and CEO of New Synergist Consulting. We provide a variety of consulting and training services in leadership development, organizational strategy, diversity, equity, and inclusion, coaching services, and in all cases, we support our products and services with data science and data analytics, or we can provide data analytics products and services as a standalone product. The agenda for today's webinar is as follows. We'll start off by discussing what unconscious bias is, as well as providing some definitions around unconscious bias and mental models. We'll also talk about the types of bias and what they mean for us. We'll have an example and a broader discussion of a tool called the ladder of inference and how it works, why it works, and what we can do to make sure it doesn't cause us to make decisions that are not in the best interest of ourselves or of our organizations. And then finally, we'll talk about some ways to mitigate unconscious bias, particularly how to make the unconscious conscious. One of the first things we should consider is the fact that we are all biased. That's the way humans are made up, and we'll talk about that in just a few moments. But the most important thing is to be more self-aware, to understand that this bias is occurring, and then making conscious decisions in order to mitigate that bias, in order that we make decisions that are, again, in our best interest as well as the organization's. So a couple definitions. Unconscious bias, it's prejudice or unsupported judgments in favor of or against one thing, a person, a group, as compared to another, in a way that is usually considered unfair and sometimes called implicit bias. Mental model, a representation of how something works. We cannot keep all of the details of our world in our brains, so we use models to simplify the complex into understandable and organizable chunks. Let's spend a few moments discussing brain science, if you will. Our brains are largely compartmentalized into two main areas, the conscious and the subconscious. Now, at any given moment, we may be inundated with 11 million bits of information. However, the human brain can only process about 40 bits. So how do we survive? How do we make decisions? How do we live day to day if we can only process 40 bits of information while we may be at any given moment receiving as many as 11 million bits of information? Without the brain's ability to process that information somehow, we couldn't survive. Our ancestors, for instance, would have more likely been food for some other species rather than being able to survive. How do you make decisions that affect your safety at any given moment? If we were to take the time to process all 11 million bits of information, think about being in the woods with a bear 50 or 75 or 100 yards away. We'd have to analyze that information through our conscious brain. We might ask ourselves questions like, is that a black bear or a brown bear? Is it male or female? Is there one or more cubs nearby that may cause this female bear, if it's female, to be more aggressive? Is the bear hungry? While we're analyzing and processing all of this information, the bear's already upon us, and we may become a meal for that bear. What we need to be able to do, and this is the good part or the great part about unconscious bias, is make very quick decisions based on past experiences, based on knowledge, and in many cases, simply based on fear. Imagine, current scientific estimates are that 95% of brain activity is unconscious. 95% unconscious. Some of these unconscious thoughts include habits, patterns that we utilize during our day, our week, our month, automatic body functions, breathing, heartbeat, creativity, emotions, personality, beliefs and values, cognitive biases, and long-term memory. So 95% of the time, we are acting, thinking, making decisions based on thoughts and cognitive processes in our unconscious brain. What this means in part is that we mostly default to operating on a closed mind. Now, I know many of us consider ourselves open-minded, and you may very well be, but it is not your default position. It is something you have to work on. So why in part is that true? Well, let's talk about our brains for a moment. While our brains are about 2 to 3% of our body mass, our brains can actually use 20 to 25% of our energy. This is why, if you've ever noticed, maybe you spend a day at work or somewhere else, sitting at a desk or a table, working on some difficult problems or a report or some other thing, and at the end of the day, you can feel drained. You can feel more tired than you would have if you had run a few miles that day or ridden a bike for a couple of hours. It's because of this use of energy. Now, in order to preserve energy, our brains operate on an efficiency principle in order to conserve energy. The result? We try to stay in our comfort zone, because if we operated in a zone where we are being open-minded, particularly about new inputs, we would have to use more brain power, more energy. So we are pre-wired to be closed-minded in order to preserve energy. So in order to conserve energy, we have to deal with something called cognitive dissonance. And that's a discomfort that occurs when confronted with ideas or beliefs that differ from what we have in our head. We dislike dissonance in part because it forces us to use more energy. So we operate with a closed mind. That allows us to block dissonance by not even giving it a chance to appear. If we are in an open-minded situation, we entertain dissonance, but obviously that will force us to use more energy in order to make good decisions. When we are operating with a closed mind, we can be inhibited by our mental models, because operating with a closed mind means we're making decisions based on some mental model we have created. And we'll talk in more specificity about mental models when we talk about the ladder of inference. But a mental model, the images, assumptions, and stories we carry around in our minds of ourselves, other people, institutions, and every aspect of the world is what causes us or leads us toward unconscious bias. Now, when we talk about unconscious bias at work, we need to talk about protected classes. And there are laws and, of course, regulations that we need to be aware of when we're making decisions at work. And those protected classes include race, gender, color, religion, national origin, disability, familial status, and sexual orientation. We need to make sure we don't put our organizations at risk or do harm to others because of unconscious bias. Let's talk briefly about unconscious bias in the workplace. Now, as we walk through these 4 areas that we're going to discuss, I'm not going to have a debate or argument with anybody who might say, I don't have that bias. That may be true, but we want to be self-aware because these are 4 areas that tend to rise to the top when we're making decisions. And we're going to talk about those 4 areas and why that may be happening. The first area is what we'll call task. So when you consider the task you're doing at work, are you associating certain jobs with a certain type of person? For instance, are you associating secretarial or administrative jobs with females? Because historically, more females have been placed in those jobs for various reasons. Are you associating STEM jobs with males? Science, technology, engineering, and math. Because historically, we have pushed women away from those types of jobs based on assumptions that those jobs are more likely suited for males. Are you associating STEM jobs with white males because you see more white males in those jobs? So think about your workplace and ask yourself, are those associations there because of your experiences, because of your background, because of what you see every day, and has that become a bias for you? Another area in the workplace that we need to examine might be called numbers. And that comes about when you're looking at a group, for instance, job applicants. Are we more likely to use our biases to analyze people in what we might also call outline demographics? So for instance, if you are rating resumes for STEM applicants, science, technology, engineering, and math, you might consider some studies that have been done where we have utilized resumes that are very similar. And on one resume, we'll place a male name, and on the other resume, we'll place a female name. When we have folks rating these resumes, even though they're very similar, if not for obvious reasons, they're not exact, the male resume gets rated a few points higher. And we're using male and female managers. And the results between the males and the females rating these resumes are fairly similar. And then just to make sure this is valid, we take those same resumes and we simply switch the names at the top. When rated again, the resume with the obvious or presumed male name gets rated a few points higher. Now, it's important to note that even those few points can have a significant impact on the diversity in your organization. Because as you do that over and over again, what may be happening is you're looking at 100 resumes, and maybe because they're STEM jobs, most of them are male anyway. So almost all of the applicants that you hire are males. And then when you think about the ladder of inference that we talk about today, maybe that even becomes embedded in the bias and causes people to think, without knowing potentially, that, well, of course, males are more suited for STEM jobs than females, and that's why most, if not all, of our new hires are male. And then let's expand that a little bit to minority candidates. And you have the same type of thing happening. So you might be espousing the fact that we need more females among our STEM candidates. We need more minorities among our STEM candidates. But our process, because of bias, is making it almost certain that we will not be reaching the diversity that we need in our organization. So when we're using these things like numbers to decide, or algorithms to decide how we're going to rate and rank new applicants, for instance, we need to also look at the results and ask ourselves, are we getting the results that we desire? If not, let's examine why we aren't getting those results. And let's make sure we don't eliminate the thought that maybe unconscious bias coupled with our mental models are at least part of the reason, if not the entire reason, for this lack of diversity. The third area we should consider is clarity, clarity of information. When information is lacking, our brains tend to fill in the gaps with what we expect to hear, what we expect to see. So we're interviewing an applicant who we expect should be able to do this job and do it well. The applicant doesn't do that well on the interview, and there seems to be some gaps in the information that is being provided. Are we likely, or is it possible, and it certainly is possible, to fill in those blanks because this applicant is a good-looking applicant on paper, and we think this is the perfect person for the job. So maybe because of a bad day or nervousness or whatever the case, we give this applicant a better score than we should have given based on how well that interview went. In other cases, maybe we don't expect an applicant to do well. And in spite of what we hear and see, we're filling in gaps that says this applicant didn't do quite as well in terms of that interview. Another area is perceiving and understanding that a heightened emotional state can keep the conscious mind distracted. So we miss things, even though they're communicated to us or we see them, we don't really process them. And then of course later we have to fill in blanks because of the things we missed, and those perceptions tend to fall back on what we already believe, based again on our experiences, our backgrounds, and what we expected, what we thought might happen. So those are 4 areas that we need to consider when we ask ourselves about the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace. And we'll talk some more about what they mean and how they can happen as we move through this webinar today. So considering the things that we've already discussed, think about what might be the real problem with unconscious bias in the workplace and in other areas of your life. The mental models created in part by unconscious bias are simplifications, which may be true actually for a particular set of conditions, and they may also be good for a limited time. So the problem is not so much whether they're true or right or wrong. The real problem arises when they become implicit, when they exist below the level of our awareness, when they are driving decisions and actions that are unconscious. They're just automatic in spite of the fact that those decisions, which may have been true yesterday, or they may not have actually, but they're definitely not true today or for this circumstance. And that lack of awareness means we don't even realize our behavior, our decisions, our actions are being dictated by a certain mental model that we have bought into very deeply and that we're not even aware of. Now let's discuss 3 mental models or biases that are prevalent in all of our lives. The first one might be called similar to me bias. In this type of bias, we tend to look for common interests among the people we deal with. So at work, if you like fishing, you would tend to gravitate toward people who fished. If you're into golfing, you might tend to gravitate toward people who are golfers. If you're a hunter, the same type of thing. So the thing we need to be careful of, are we providing more confidence, more support, more training, for instance, to people who are similar to us, who look like us, who think like us, who act like us? And if we're not careful, are we creating an environment that requires individuals to be like us in order to be successful, in order to get the best pay raises, in order to get the prime jobs, in order to get jobs that will help them be promoted at some point in the future? The next type of bias is confirmation bias. And this bias revolves around how we seek, interpret, and remember information. There's a tendency to look for information that confirms what we know or think we know, or what we believe to be true. So we look for that confirmation in information we seek when we're looking at resumes, when we're interviewing somebody, when we are looking for answers that might revolve around all types of decisions. Boy, I really want this type of car, for instance. So we're looking for confirmation that that's the right car for us, even though it might not be. And maybe we're dismissing those might not be while we're highlighting all of the reasons that that is exactly the right car. Even though it may cost too much, it only has 2 seats and we have a family, hey, but the spouse has a 4-door SUV or van, so it'll work, and maybe it will. But we are tending to look for confirmation that our beliefs the knowledge we have, our experiences are based on accuracy and based on facts. And therefore, when we see something that fits into this scheme, it confirms what we already believe is true, even though it might not be so. The third type of bias is attentional bias. What are you focused on? What grabs your attention? What do you like? What do you dislike? The focus you place on certain things or certain types of people can affect your decision because they create these mental models based on bias that allows us, forces us, or maybe just supports decisions we're making. So we need to be aware of where we're placing our attention. If a company or a group of individuals that are managing this part of the business are focusing on profits, they might be ignoring capital improvements that can support profits in the out years because they're focusing on profits right now. If a company is focusing too much on quality, and you might say, how can you focus too much on quality? Well, just to give you an example, Toyota at one point used to paint the fender wells in cars, a place nobody could see, a place because of the materials they were using wasn't going to rust. So it really didn't affect the quality of their cars. And guess what? They could save some money by not painting those fender wells. So we need to be careful in all cases about placing too much focus or attention on acts or individuals or types of people or whatever that may be causing us to focus too much on things that are really based on a mental model that's not accurate, because that of course can lead to unconscious bias. So let's talk specifically about decisions and decision making. And let's understand that decision making is impacted or limited in terms of rationality by the information you have. And it's difficult, with that fact being true, to make complex decisions because we'll likely never have all the information we need in order to make a perfectly accurate decision. When you think about unconscious bias or mental models, think about ideas in a large organization, or even maybe a smaller one, that never seem to see the light of day. Why is that? These are great ideas. Well, we need to think about whether or not these ideas conflict with deeply held internal images of how the world works, even how our organization should work. These images can limit us to familiar ways of thinking and acting. And they're based on images, assumptions, stories that lead to generalizations that dictate or drive actions, or what we might call our viewpoint of the world. Imagine, as the story goes, that a group of American auto manufacturing leaders pay a visit to several Japanese auto plants, let's say in the 60s. And at that time, the Japanese were starting to make a dent in terms of the number of vehicles sold in the United States. And of course, with the oil shock that occurred in the early 70s, their market share jumped significantly. Now, even then, based on some history, Japanese products were thought of as inferior in terms of quality. But we're starting to see Japanese automobiles that were of similar quality or even higher quality than American-made products. So what's going on? Well, let's go see, and that makes sense. So when they got there, as the story is told, they saw automobile plants without much room for parts. And now at that time, American auto manufacturers had, huge warehouses filled with parts that were going to be used on the assembly line. The Japanese had moved to a system called just-in-time manufacturing, where they would plan for parts to be delivered just before they were needed. So they didn't have many parts sitting there. But based on the assumptions, the mental models, the bias that these American leaders had for the way an automobile plant should run, the assumption was made by many that the Japanese were trying to fake them out. They were hiding certain things about the way they manufactured cars. Therefore, maybe this trip was just a total waste of time. Because if they're hiding the fact that they have all these parts somewhere, what else are they hiding? Therefore, the trip was a waste of time and we didn't learn anything. Well, we know that this just-in-time manufacturing, this Kaizen, were among the main reasons that the Japanese were able to produce cars faster and of higher quality, among other things. But that deeply held assumption, that deeply held mental model, that deeply held bias could lead you to ignore everything you saw, everything you heard. And one of the things we haven't discussed, but I'd like to mention it here, is this issue of unconscious bias or mental models has nothing to do with intellect or intelligence. You can be as smart as anybody or smarter than most and still have unconscious bias. And we're going to talk about that as we talk about the ladder of inference. So I want you to consider 3 questions as we walk through the ladder of inference and how it works. Question 1, can I change my unconscious bias? Question 2, how does our unconscious bias affect our decisions? And question 3, how does our unconscious bias affect our relationships? Instantly. It's going to take us a few minutes to step up the ladder of inference, but when we actually use it in practice, it happens almost instantly. And the only way to change what is happening based on our personal ladders of inference is to utilize reflection and to continuously ask ourselves, are our mental models accurate? And are they helping us produce the results that we would like? To start our journey up the ladder of inference, let's first talk about experiences and observations. Let's think about those as a video recording, where the video camera is capturing data. We hear words, we observe body language, we collect information. On the next step, and this is where things can start to go amiss, we select data based on what we think is relevant and what we think is irrelevant. We got 11 million bits of information possibly coming at us. We just don't have time to spend making sure all 11 million bits are relevant. So we're making a decision about what's relevant and not relevant. From there, we add meanings based on what we feel is reasonable according to data we selected. Remember, when there's a vacuum in terms of information, we want to fill that gap somehow, and we want to do it quickly. Next step up the ladder, we start to make assumptions about the data we've selected and the meanings we've derived from that data, assuming they are accurate and represent reality. On the next step up the ladder, we draw conclusions. Of course, we're filling in that blank. What does this mean? We made some assumptions. So based on our assumptions and based on what we think is best for us, for those around us, for our organization, for our team, we draw conclusions. Here's what that means. Here's what's going on. And the next step up the ladder, we start to adopt beliefs based on these conclusions. And we adopt those beliefs based on our belief that everyone is coming to the same conclusion and the same belief. Because of course, the beliefs we've adopted are accurate. And the next step up the ladder is we take action. We act. We act based on those beliefs as if they are proven facts. And then maybe more importantly, we adjust new data to fit into those beliefs. In other words, if we see new data that doesn't quite fit with the conclusions we've come to, we start to adjust those meanings to make them fit. Remember the 3 types of unconscious bias we talked about. That's what we do. We use those 3 types to make sure we understand the belief or beliefs we have. So when you take the bias, for instance, called confirmation bias, we want to use that, or we do use that, to confirm what we're seeing, to confirm the conclusions we're making, to confirm the beliefs we have, those mental models, to justify our actions. And then finally, when we experience the same or similar event, or same or similar data and observations, our reflexive loop starts to cement those in and make that mental model even more solid, more secure, and of course, potentially more biased. Because we use this ladder again, and as we start to make those observations and select data and add meanings and make assumptions and come to conclusions, our confirmation bias makes it more difficult to make changes, and less likely that we will make changes to our beliefs, which of course means we won't change our actions or the way we do things. So let's now talk about an example of how this might work in real life. You're driving home from work one day, and it's been a not good day. You're not in a good mood. You're feeling stressed. And all of a sudden, this guy cuts you off. And he looks right at you, and he just keeps going. And as you're walking up that ladder of inference, you think, people like him are always cutting me off. They don't care. I've come to the conclusion that people like him need to be addressed. And that's going to happen today. So you start to follow him. And he's really driving recklessly and speeding and all of that. And he pulls into a parking lot. And you say, okay, I got him now. And he whips into this space, which is not really a parking space. And he's parked there, in a very in a way that blocks other people, whether they be walking or whether they might be driving their car through this parking lot. And you say, well, now he's gonna get a piece of my mind. And you jump out of the car to address this person. And as you're walking toward him, he says to you, hey, I'm really sorry. My son had a really bad injury and I'm frantic and we're trying to get him to the emergency room. And then you realize you're in the parking lot at the emergency room of a hospital and you see this kid who's unconscious and obviously bleeding. And you realize you made a mistake. That ladder of inference that you went up to in a split second, caused in part by your emotions, caused in part by your confirmation bias based on the type of person that was driving that car, based on the events that happened, that, hey, that's wrong, that's dangerous, that's inconsiderate, that's rude. And now, though, you start to calm down, hopefully, because you realize, wow, what this person did was wrong. You at least understand why he did it. And that's important for us to understand as we try to think of other people in terms of the way they see the world and not just of the way we see the world. And I will share with you something I heard that I think is really a good way to look at our biases to make sure they are accurate. You've all heard, I'm sure, of the golden rule. Treat others as you would have them treat yourself. So in this case, with this driver, before you knew why he was driving the way he was driving, you would expect him to treat you in a manner that is safe, that is courteous, by not cutting you off and driving recklessly. But if we adhere to the platinum rule, which is treat others as they would like to be treated, we would start to see that if my son was in a bad accident, unconscious, bleeding, and I'm rushing him to the hospital, I want everybody to move out of the way and let me go as fast as I need to go to get him there as quickly as possible. So hopefully the doctors, the nurses, and the staff at that hospital can ensure that he has a full and healthy recovery. So I would like you to consider several other thoughts about mental models and unconscious bias and how we can work to mitigate or as much as possible eliminate them so we make better decisions in practice about what works and what doesn't work, what's right and what's wrong, so we can be better decision makers. Our mental models determine what we see and what we don't see. The symbols that we use to mentally process the environment in which we function, the environment around us. So we need to be careful about simple generalizations like people are untrustworthy, or even complex theories, including assumptions about the reason members of my family or members of my team at work interact with me the way they do. Most importantly, though, is mental models are active and they shape the way we act. The decisions we make, the actions we engage in. So we need to remember the powers of mental models on our actions they become that cognitive lens through which we view the world. Remember those 3 types of unconscious bias that we talked about. 2 people with different mental models can see the exact same situation and describe it differently. And they may also violently argue that they are right, and they believe it. So it can be said that people observe selectively based on their mental models and act accordingly. So some of the things we want to do, if you want to work with this and see what you can do to fix it, start with 5 to 10 beliefs or mental models that you have that may be limiting your ability to achieve your desired results. Your mental models may be inherent based on what you believe your abilities are, how you believe people around you are treating you, why certain possibilities haven't come your way, why you haven't been promoted, why your organization isn't more successful, why the organization isn't willing to take a risk. Whatever it may be, look at each belief and ask yourself, is that belief being reinforced by your actions and the results you're getting? Now consider the source of those beliefs. Do you have data to support any beliefs that could help you achieve your desired results? And then, what actions should you consider taking, even if they are not supported by your beliefs? Remember, we're looking for results. So your beliefs are your beliefs, but we want to make sure we understand what they are. The discipline involved with working with our mental models and uncovering unconscious bias starts with looking inward. It starts with self-awareness about who we are, what we do, why we are taking certain actions and making certain decisions, and asking ourselves, are we okay with the results that we are getting? We want to learn how to unearth our internal pictures of the world in order to bring them to the surface and hold them rigorously to scrutiny. So it involves surfacing these models, whatever they are, testing these models to make sure they're accurate, and improving our internal pictures of how the world really works. So start with results. That's probably the easiest in some ways to identify, but it's also difficult because you have to actually look inward on what's going on. So take 2 to 3 results that you might not find satisfactory, whatever they are. They can involve your team, they can involve you personally. Take note of your behavior or the actions that are contributing to these results. Then identify the mental models or beliefs that have led you to these actions. Now consider the source of these beliefs. Do you have data that supports them, that could help you achieve your desired results? What actions should you consider taking, even if those actions don't fit with your current beliefs? As we start to think about overcoming unconscious bias and reflecting on our mental models, there are 2 areas we definitely want to make sure we're doing a good job at. And one area is reflection. The other area is the skill of inquiry and what I like to call appreciative inquiry, which is a great tool that if you don't know about, you really need to spend some time looking at what appreciative inquiry means. The skill of reflection is concerned with slowing down our thinking processes so that we can become more aware of how we form our mental models and the ways they influence our actions. So we want to be reflective. What happened? Why did it happen? Is my mental model of the cause really accurate? Is it the true cause or the only cause for the results that I'm getting? And secondly, the skill of inquiry. How do you operate in face-to-face interactions with others, particularly when you're dealing with complex or conflicting issues? This is where the rubber really meets the road, why ideas tend to die, or why people aren't willing to share their ideas, or when they do share an idea, it's ridiculed or ignored, or the response is provided in a way that may make people feel that sharing ideas is a waste of time, so I'm not going to do it anymore. When we consider reflection, ask yourself, what has really led me to think and feel this way? What was my intention? What was I trying to accomplish? Did I achieve the results that were intended? How have your comments or lack of comments contributed to the difficulties you're seeing? Why didn't I say what was in my left-hand column? In other words, why didn't I say what I was thinking? What assumptions am I making about the other person or other people involved in this process? How much is it really costing us to operate this way? And what are the payoffs, if any? A powerful question, while all these are powerful, I really like this one. What prevented me from acting differently? And how can I use that left-hand column, that column in terms of what I was thinking, as a resource to improve communications on my team or in my organization? In other words, we want to work to overcome what Peter Senge in the fifth discipline called the basic diseases of the hierarchy. Traditional authoritarian organizations manage, organize, control, to the creation of learning organizations where the dogma is vision, values, and mental models. Healthy firms are the ones that bring people together to develop the best possible mental models for facing any situation. So the core values that you need to think about are both openness, and for individuals, that means being open-minded, and merit. Regardless of what a person looks like, regardless of the color of their skin or their age or anything else about them, these characteristics, we want to base our decisions on merit, on what creates the best payoff for all stakeholders, and that of course includes employees, in our organization. We also want to make sure that at an individual level, we understand the ladder of inference and all of those things about it that might be causing us to make decisions and take actions that are not in our best interest or in the best interest of our organization, of our families, of our friends and relatives. Well, we just provided some questions that individuals can ask themselves in order to uncover unconscious bias and examine the accuracy of their mental models. What should organizations be doing? Well, there are probably three macro level steps that they can be taking. And the first one is to provide the support and tools needed to allow their employees to examine and improve their self-awareness. Tools that can help them uncover mental models that may not accurately reflect company values, company vision. Secondly, while you're examining those values and organizational vision, you should also ask yourself, are we getting the results that we desire based on those values and based on the organizational vision. Are we making decisions that are aligned with our values? Are we taking actions that are aligned with those values? And if not, let's figure out what we should be doing differently. And finally, do we have a culture that allows individuals and supports them when they ask why? Why aren't we getting the results that we need? Why does it seem like certain individuals, based on their ethnicity or gender or age, are not getting the same types of support and promotions and raises that others might be getting? Let's use analytics to actually make sure that the results we're getting are in line with what we would expect based on demographics, based on the numbers of people we have in the organization, based on our company values. If you can start down that path of doing those three things, you pretty much can guarantee that your organization will become more diverse, more productive, and thus create better results. As we wrap up our session today, I'd like to provide just another maybe fun or not so fun example of the potential for unconscious bias. So imagine one morning a mom wakes up and she knows it's time for her son to get ready for school. So she goes into his room to wake him up, and she says, "Hey, hurry up. You're going to be late for school again." And he says, "Mom, I really don't want to go to school today. I just don't feel like it." And she says, "What's going on? You know you have to go to school today." I don't want to." And then finally she says, "You're the principal. You have to go to school today." Now, while you may not have all thought that, we're making judgments about that conversation. And those judgments likely centered around, boy, you know how kids are. Sometimes, some kids anyway, just don't want to go to school. It's likely you didn't think about maybe it's an adult. And then even when we considered that, oh, it must be an adult because he's the principal, you may be also considering, well, what is wrong with him? Why is he still living at home with his mom? There must be something wrong with him. Well, maybe he, just went through a divorce and he had to move into the home for a brief period, hopefully. Or maybe some other reason. The point is, we don't know until we get all the facts. And even then, or even if we can't get all the facts, let's make sure to reflect on any inferences that we're making about what's happening. One thing is certain. We are built, we are designed in a way that supports unconscious bias. And if we don't reflect on those potential biases, they become hardened in such a way that they become part of our mental models. And that makes them even more difficult to resolve, more difficult to understand and surface as potential problems. And if we don't reflect on them and ask ourselves, why are certain things happening? Why are we making certain decisions in the workplace, at home, in terms of deciding all types of things that we may be purchasing? We may be walking blindly into areas that we really don't want to be in. So it's critically important to use tools that can help you be more self-aware, use reflection to make sure you understand why certain decisions have been made by you or by others, so you can examine and hopefully mitigate the negative impacts that can be caused by unconscious bias. Thank you very much for watching this video today, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I hope you are on your way to making the unconscious conscious. I see you.